Hello and welcome to Astrology with Zeke. So, this is going to be a continuation of the historical figures series, and basically an add-on to the video of Queen Elizabeth I that I did. In that, today we're going to be going over her mother's chart, which, as we all know, is Anne Boleyn, who was the second wife of Henry VIII and the first wife of Henry's that he actually had executed, very famously. Um, as up to that point, any monarch being executed, really for anything, was next to unheard of. In fact, the accusations laid at her feet to basically justify the beheading, I mean, some of them were just so outlandish and ridiculous. I don't think anybody seriously believed them. Um, I think one of the craziest ones was is she was accused of having an incestuous relationship with her brother. Just to give you an idea of some of the stuff they said about her. So, anyways, she sounds like a really interesting lady, and one of my viewers suggested I do her chart. So, here we are. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and dig in. All right. So, the first thing that I see about Anne Boleyn is she is a Leo rising with her chart ruler, the sun, being in Taurus 10th house. So, first, we'll talk about Leo risings. What is a Leo rising? A Leo rising is someone who's very apparent that they are charismatic, kind of showy. They have a tendency to like being the center of attention, but they also tend to be very fun people, kind of the life of the party type. And with her son being in Taurus, this kind of gives it the flavor of her being very well known for being generally a very pleasant person, grounded, but fun to be around. Like she didn't let herself get away with herself emotionally, but she was still just one of those people that had a strong, steady presence and kind of a charisma. Just an overall a very pleasant person. Uh, at least if you were ever to meet her on that kind of surface level, that would be your first impression of her. So, anyways, let's go ahead and move on and just talk about the aspects that her son makes. So, like I said, she's a Taurus sun, with it being in the 10th house, which is the house of career and what you're known for. And it's making a number of aspects, mostly positive, but there is a hard one that I'll get back to. I'll go over the positives first. So it is making a really nice sextile to her Uranus in Pisces, which is the eighth house. And eighth house is all about joint finances. Um, it's the house of sorrows. It does have to do with, it can have to do with sexuality, which I've done charts for some people where they had Uranus in the eighth house, which led me to believe they had an unusual sexuality. But in Anne Boleyn's case, I don't think that's true. I think this has more to do with finances and debts, given that the ruler of her eighth house is Jupiter, and Jupiter is right there in the second house, which is the second house. It's all about finance, it's about money, and is in Libra, which it's really not a great placement for the second house. That means she had really expensive tastes and was really loose with spending her money. Um, but this is about the going back to the eighth house is about joint finances. So what that tells me is she probably had sizable debts that probably weren't necessarily hers alone. That being said, she probably did contribute to that because I can tell she's a woman of fine tastes. And the other thing about Taurus suns is they tend to get a lot out of sensual pleasures and having beautiful things around them. And with that sextile, that means it's a harmonious relationship, so it flows more evenly or easily, rather. What's also interesting about her sun is it makes a really nice trine to her north node in Capricorn. It's in the fifth house, which is the house about children, creativity, what we do for fun. And kind of what this means is she's moving towards finding a lifelong journey of finding new and better ways to have fun, to get pleasure. But one thing that kind of struck me, especially with who we're talking about and the houses that everything is in, is the ruler of her north node, which is Saturn. And when you look at her chart, her Saturn is in the 12th house, which is the house of self-undoing and places of isolation. And it's in Leo. It's really close to her ascendant. And it's making a near exact square to her sun in Taurus, which, the sun is the self, the ego, you. And with the North Node being ruled by Saturn, and it's in the fifth house, which is about children, to my mind, this just kind of shows that it was like she was destined to have issues with bearing children. Because that's the other thing too, is Capricorn is it's it's the beginning of winter. It starts on the winter solstice. And that tells me it's just not a fertile sign. Like Capricorn's really good at managing what they have, not necessarily creating something new. And then when you look at how Saturn is in a house that it does not like, and it's squaring the planet that represents the self, which isn't a fertile sign, it just tells me that she was destined to have issues when it comes to children. You know, very unfortunate. And that's the other thing too, is the 12th house has to do with institutions, and her husband was a king. So it's all over there. Anyways, I just found that really fascinating. Sad but fascinating. So uh yeah, anyways, we'll move on from that. The next aspect that I'll go ahead and talk about is I'll just go over her moon. So she's a Pisces moon in the seventh house. And Pisces is, the sign of the dreamer, the artist, the archetypal priest. And the moon is the sign about how we get, how we're nurtured. It describes how we find security. And people who are Pisces moons tend to be very, very spiritual people. And but unfortunately, like even though having the moon in Pisces, it typically isn't bad. It's just really not making a whole lot of positive aspects, unfortunately. The one positive aspect that it's making is a sextile to her Mars in Taurus, which Mars doesn't like being in the Taurus. It doesn't mean that she was necessarily weak or bad at asserting herself or standing up for herself, but people with Mars and Taurus tend to have a hard time or tend to be very steady people, very slow, um, but very hard to lose their temper. But once they do, watch out because they'll come for you and they will not stop. And with this, I think this has a lot to do with because the moon's exalted in Taurus. So I think she was just an incredibly grounded person. Um, he probably almost never lost her temper. Had a really good grip on her emotions, which is great. But her moon is at the apex of a pretty big T square. It's squaring her Pluto in Sagittarius fourth house, and also squaring her Mercury in Gemini 10th house. And Gemini in the 10th house, or Mercury in Gemini, it means it's domicile. So that does mean she was a highly intelligent, very quick-witted. Um, that doesn't, they like to keep things light. They don't like to get too close to people's, like they'll often get accused of being aloof, or not serious. So this is that's why it's a square with her moon. It's strange. It's not necessarily bad. It's that it's strange. So even though she's privately this really spiritual person, especially in one-on-one relationships, she appeared aloof, detached, yet witty, um, in the public, very sharp. So it's strange. But I think the one that's harder would be the square with Pluto, because Pluto is the planet that's about the abuse and misuse of power, and hidden things, secrets. And with it being in her fourth house, and with the ruler of Pluto being, again, Jupiter in the house of money, uh, it's something that we already kind of know is there's probably a lot of money issues within her family growing up. And, she was probably in fact, I'm pretty sure it's known that she was effectively forced to basically seduce Henry VIII by her father so that, the family could basically get out of debt. And that's kind of what this is saying is, to my mind, it's kind of saying she didn't necessarily want to pursue Henry VIII of her own free will. She did it for her family, for her family's behalf. And that's what's kind of interesting too, is Pisces, the sign of self-undoing, and they can be empathetic to the point of self-detriment and completely put aside their own self-interest to help everybody else out, believing they have to help everybody else out, yet you know have a really hard time with taking care of themselves. So yeah, that's just a very unfortunate aspect. Um, yeah, the other thing that I did want to talk about is well, I can see in her chart that I'm sure I don't need to mention this as everybody's got two brain cells to rub together, but there's nothing in her chart that says she had a brother fetish. You know, that being said, she does have Venus in Aries, and that's in the eighth house. So that does mean that is a pretty sexual placement. But what's interesting here is that doesn't mean that, she was a loose woman. That's not really what I'm picking up here because, like I said, she was also a highly intelligent woman. Her Venus is making a sextile to Mercury and Gemini. And that tells me, I think she just really liked being chased. Like, you know, but she also had the wits to know that she couldn't follow through with a lot of those kind of things, given her aspirations and who she was, especially at the time she was born. But I do think she really liked that. So, anyways, that's just something I wanted to touch on. It's just something that kind of made me chuckle, but isn't necessarily a bad thing. So, um, yeah, we could also talk about just her 12th house, just because Saturn is there. And interestingly enough, the ruler of her 12th house is that Taurus sun, and it's in the 10th house. So her hidden enemies well, could be honestly be both of these. One, her father, as Leo is the sign of the father, given that it's ruled by the sun. But personally, I think it's also just her coworkers, her own career, um, the people she was surrounded with in her public life. And honestly, that just makes sense to me because um, she was well known to let just speak her mind and let her opinions be known. And she was actually also very smart, very well educated. And a lot of men around her, frankly, didn't care for being talked to in that way. In fact, there was a disagreement between her and one of the king's advisors, Cromwell, over money. I believe that Cromwell wanted to use the money, basically wanted to conserve the money. He was a fiscal conservative and he wanted to save the money, whereas Anne Boleyn wanted to use the money for a lot of charitable works, which to my mind makes a lot of sense for her, as again her Jupiter is in the second house in Libra. The second house can also have a lot to do with your values, and that's a very Libran thing to do. It's about fairness, it's about justice, it's about kind of doing things for other people. And given that it's a benefic there, that just makes sense to me. That being said, I think Cromwell really didn't like being spoken to in that way. And there's a conspiracy that basically he put out all the stuff out there to get her arrested and eventually executed because of this beef between them. It's a theory that isn't really accepted by historians nowadays. Nowadays, historians believe Henry VIII was basically looking for a reason to get rid of Anne Boleyn, as she didn't produce a male heir and coerced Cromwell into putting out a bunch of nonsense. But after looking at this chart, I think she had hidden enemies all over court. And I can see this further given that her Chiron is in the first house in Virgo. And Chiron is, the wounded healer. It represents a wound. It's in the first house, which is the self. And with it being Virgo, this has to do with the intellect. And it's also a feminine sign. And with the ruler of her Chiron being in the 10th house, being Mercury, being in Gemini where it's domiciled, this clearly means that she was highly intelligent, but because she was a woman, she wasn't respected, or at least not respected, and unable to move up in the world in the ways that she felt she was capable of or deserved. Excuse me. And to my mind, that just makes all kinds of sense. What more can we say about that? I mean, her execution was pretty famous. We all know why it was. And it was ultimately because, she couldn't produce a male heir, or at least that's what really started things. But personally, I think there was more to it. I think there was a lot of members at court who were more than willing to go along with Henry VIII because they had a beef with her specifically because she was a woman who was basically challenging their intellect and making them feel insecure. So, yeah, very unfortunate because if she was born at a different time, I think she would have done very well for herself. But there you go. So, yep. Anyways, I think that'll about do it for Anne Boleyn. It's been an absolute blast going over her chart. I think she was a very fascinating woman, very interesting, very terrible and unfortunate the things that happened to her, as I think she was a highly capable woman and could have done so much more, but was a victim of circumstances and the time she was born in. So, yeah, what are you gonna do? Anyways, that'll about do it for today. If there's anybody else you'd like me to do, I don't know. I might just go ahead and do a series on the Tudor family. But if there's anybody else you'd like me to do, go ahead and leave a name in the comments. Also, I do want to say that I do this professionally. So if you want to book my services, go ahead and check out my website, astrologywithseek.com. I will link that in the description below. Anyways, that'll do it for today, and we'll see you all next time.